my name is Madison Franks, and I'm going to talk about wild waterfowl and highly pathogenic avian influenza. First, I'm going to discuss wild waterfowl as disease vectors and why this disease has spread so far and so wide. So, one of the things that unfortunately makes wild ducks really excellent vectors of disease is that, famously, they embark on really lengthy migrations, sometimes spanning continents. Now, it's hard to know the full scope of this because we can't really know how far a duck migrates unless it's been banded or fitted with a tracking device of some kind. But we do know that they fairly regularly embark on international migrations, and there's been 2 reported instances of pintail hens traveling over 2,000 miles from Russia to Louisiana and back in a single day. Weirdly, they also followed almost the same path, so maybe this is a migration pathway that just hasn't been well documented yet. But regardless, they certainly span continents and unfortunately can serve as a source of disease transmission from one country to another. The other thing that makes ducks, unfortunately, an excellent disease vector is that they're highly social animals. So when a duck is sick, it doesn't social distance, it socializes. They naturally gravitate to other areas inhabited by ducks and regularly intermingle not only with ducks within the same species or even type of species, such as diving ducks or puddle ducks, but they regularly intermingle with every kind of waterfowl in a given area. They're super incentivized to do this because these highly social flocks help them avoid predators and also find potential mates. But unfortunately, this means that disease can transmit through a population of waterfowl very rapidly and very thoroughly. Additionally, flocks of ducks are dynamic. I already talked about how they love to intermingle with each other, but unfortunately for disease control, not only do they intermingle with each other, but a flock of ducks is very rarely static. Flocks will split up, combine, and scramble with each other all of the time. And while this is very excellent at preventing inbreeding, it also ensures that if one duck has some kind of illness, that a very large number of other ducks are also exposed to it very rapidly. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about where HPAI came from. So it was first documented in Guangdong, China, in domestic geese. Now, this strain was responsible for the current outbreak, but it isn't identical to the strain that is causing the current outbreak. Initially, this virus seemed to kind of just go away without incident, but once again, as we discussed earlier, ducks and especially waterfowl are birds and especially waterfowl are excellent in transmitting disease, and unfortunately it was detected in wild birds in Hong Kong in 2002. This unfortunately served as the starting point of a much larger outbreak, and eventually that same strain spread to North America, presumably from waterfowl, where it then caused the deaths of 50 million poultry. Now, before we talk about the implications of that, we're going to discuss how wild birds are affected, just so you have a more thorough picture of this disease and kind of the havoc that it causes. So, despite spreading because of wild birds, the virus didn't really become entrenched in the wild waterfowl population, at least in America, until as late as 2021. And at that point, it became really ubiquitous in the population, even though it's hard to get an incredibly clear picture of just how common it is. We do know that wild waterfowl are very commonly and very widely affected across the Americas. The symptoms of HPAI in ducks include just a general nervousness, as well as tremors, lack of coordination, swelling around the head, neck, and eyes, a lack of energy or movement, coughing, gasping for air, sneezing, diarrhea, as well as sudden death. So even though this is generally a respiratory disease and is generally spread through respiratory secretions, it can affect them in a variety of ways, which also kind of makes it difficult to diagnose because you can't track it down to any single organ system. Now, because HPAI is so widespread and because those symptoms are so severe, it's pretty natural to think that this would have absolutely hammered the wild waterfowl population and that we would be seeing deficits in these wild birds because of it, but thankfully that's really not the case. Despite that, the disease is really hard to control in wild birds. They haven't really been affected by it, partially because they've been exposed to it so rapidly and were able to build immunity, but the spread of this disease is still a problem. So that kind of begs the question of what to do about it. Now, despite all of those severe symptoms, there are quite a few birds that never really show clinical signs and just kind of serve as carriers, and that makes it much more difficult to track them down and not only really understand how widespread this disease is, but also to treat it if we were so inclined. As we mentioned before, just detecting this disease is challenging, but that's really not the only obstacle to treating it in wild birds. It's also just incredibly difficult to develop vaccines for influenza viruses just because of their rapidly mutating nature. By the time we developed a vaccine or treatment, it's highly likely that the virus would have mutated again, and especially in wild birds, wouldn't really resemble the disease that we developed a vaccine for. So unfortunately, treating wild birds doesn't seem to be a viable option for control of this disease. So I mentioned before that the wild bird population wasn't really impacted, but that kind of begs the question of why. And while I don't think we've been able to nail down a very specific reason, I think the answer lies in the same factors that make ducks such an effective disease vector in the first place. Even though they travel long distances, interact with a lot of ducks, and spread diseases really quickly between them, that also means that they're exposed to these diseases a lot, and they're exposed to these diseases early, and the birds that are capable of living through this illness do so and then reproduce, and thankfully resistance to HPAI has developed really rapidly in wild waterfowl, and while they certainly still get sick and die from this disease, they don't seem to do so on a scale that really negatively impacts their population. Unfortunately, domestic poultry aren't so lucky. Now, while domestic poultry are extremely negatively impacted by HPAI, there is kind of the question of how they're impacted by it, because one of the most notable features of commercial poultry production is that the birds are raised in extremely secure facilities where they're not really allowed contact with the outside world. Yet they still manage to contract HPAI from wild ducks. So that manages to happen because those wild birds shed highly pathogenic avian influenza in their saliva, nasal secretions, and feces, and when they congregate outside of a poultry facility, perhaps to pick up feed that has fallen from a feed truck or something like that, they spread those bodily fluids around that production facility, and then feed trucks or personnel or other various fomites can pick up that disease and carry it into the flock of domestic poultry. And when that happens, it's absolutely devastating. So even though improved biosecurity could reduce the severity of this problem, it's still really easy to have something like that happen because it's not always clear when wild birds have been in an area. And unfortunately, this problem isn't unique to waterfowl. I chose to talk about it in waterfowl because I see the impacts of that in the wild bird population as someone who is an avid duck hunter and who really cares about waterfowl. But other birds can spread this disease as well, and as I'm sure you can imagine, it's practically impossible and probably ill-advised to try and eliminate all of the birds from a single area. So the answer to this is really going to have to lie in biosecurity as opposed to just absolutely eliminating the birds from around poultry production facilities. So we already discussed why wild birds have developed a resistance to it, but that kind of begs the question of why domestic poultry are so susceptible. In sharp contrast to wild ducks that live fast and die young, kind of, and are rapidly exposed to these diseases and either build immunity to them or don't, but have these challenged immune systems that are capable of dealing with the environment, Domestic poultry live in a really protected area from outside disease. Their immune systems aren't really exposed to anything outside of the poultry house unless something like HPAI is tracked in, and so when it is, it's absolutely devastating. So devastating, in fact, that when domestic poultry contract this disease, the fatality rate is between 90 to 100% within 48 hours. So this disease is absolutely devastating, and when it becomes entrenched in a poultry house, unfortunately, mass euthanization of the birds is really the only option. So that poses the question, what kind of threat does HPAI pose to mammals? Because dairy cattle and their problems with HPAI have been in the news lately. So HPAI has been documented as able to spread to mammals since 2020 when it was found in a human child who contracted it from poultry in China. Now, that seems really alarming, but it is very different from the current outbreak because that was a transmission from birds to mammals directly and not between mammals of that virus. At about that time, other mammal species were also documented as contracting the disease from poultry and other birds, including seals, foxes, and domestic cats. So this definitely wasn't something that was specific to one mammal species. No one mammal species seemed to be more susceptible to it at the time. It just kind of seemed to be whatever animals were around infected birds. That all changed fairly recently. On April 1st of 2024, the CDC confirmed one human HPAI case from a person in Texas that contracted it from dairy cows. Now, to reiterate, this is really important because this was the first documented transmission of mammal-to-mammal transmission of HPAI. So, from that point onward, the CDC began reporting additional sporadic human cases in people who had exposure to infected dairy cows specifically. It's possible that this disease could be able to transmit from other species of mammals than cows to other mammals, but that seems to be the current problem. So, in summary, highly pathogenic avian influenza primarily impacts wild waterfowl because they've but they've managed to adapt to it through building immunity after extremely high exposure rates. Unfortunately, this makes them excellent carriers of the virus, which is highly, highly fatal to domestic poultry and which can be spread to mammals like cattle and from cattle to humans. This really makes it noteworthy as an emerging disease because it's possible for it to mutate further in unexpected ways like it did from birds to cattle and then from cattle to humans in the first place. So this is definitely a disease that's worth monitoring and trying to control if we can. Thank you very much for your time. Here's my name and contact information if you have any more questions, and here are my sources. Thank you very much. Goodbye.